Why do people hate Nintendo? Sup y'all, welcome back to the review space. Today I'm going to be answering a question on Quora.com. Why do people hate Nintendo? And this is a very interesting question. I've been meaning to talk about Nintendo for a while now. It's been a while since I talked about specific companies like Nintendo, and I haven't really spoken about even something like the Nintendo Switch, when that dropped. I basically have stayed silent regarding the NX. Back then it was called the NX a couple of years ago, before the Switch was actually revealed. So, why do people hate Nintendo? And this is a very loaded question. I mean, this is one of those, you're already assuming that a ton of people hate Nintendo. It's already, the word hate brings up so much emotion, people can't stand Nintendo. Some people hate it. But this idea that people hate Nintendo goes back decades. As far back as the mid-90s, when I really started to get into video games when I was a kid back then. So when I was around 9 or 10 years old, 11, 12 years old, back in the mid-late 90s, you would hear sometimes from people and other gamers that played other consoles that they can't stand Nintendo. I hate Nintendo. I don't play Nintendo. Nintendo is for kids. Nintendo is for children. Nintendo is for young people, and it's too kiddie. It's kiddified. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. For many years, ever since they began as a gaming company or a publisher of video games, Nintendo has been mostly catered towards young gamers, to a younger audience, and to more rated E for everyone, or kids to adults. So basically, young kids, or video games that young kids can play, and not necessarily adult-oriented games or more mature video games. There's a few exceptions every now and then. I remember back in the Super Nintendo era, they had games like Mortal Kombat 2. MK2 was very bloody and violent, and definitely a game that I wouldn't say is for children, for young kids. It's definitely more for a more mature audience, but that's the exception to the rule. Mortal Kombat 2 was an exception. It was very violent, but it's just one of a very few amount of games that were directed to an older, and even I would say the video game before that, the first Mortal Kombat for the Super Nintendo back in the early 90s, was kind of gutted down. It wasn't up to par. It didn't have the same brutality or the same faithful adaptation that the Genesis got. The Sega Genesis version was actually superior presentation-wise to the Super Nintendo version. The Super Nintendo version removed a lot of the violence and the basically the gore factor of the original Mortal Kombat. But of course, Nintendo learned their lesson, and by the sequel, by MK2, they were able to retain a lot of the violence. So, understandably, Nintendo will do things that's beneficial for them, even if it has violence in it. The reason why they allowed Mortal Kombat 2 to be as violent as it was is because they were seeing how the Genesis version was basically better. People like the Genesis version better. We can't have this. We gotta have a really good port of this game on our console. So when MK2 came around, Mortal Kombat 2 came out, they're like, all right, let's make a really, have it be a really great port, have all the blood and the gore and, the fatalities in it, and just be a really good, port of the original arcade game. So, and because that affected their business, they were like, man, the competition is basically getting a superior version. People like the competition's port better than ours. The Sega Genesis version of Mortal Kombat is better than the Super Nintendo. All right, we got to up it up. We got to make a, we can't screw around. We can't limit this game, and we can't basically make it a kid-friendly game. It has to be a violent game. So MK2 came around. It was violent for the Super Nintendo. But generally, Nintendo games, especially Nintendo exclusives, have basically been kid-friendly games. The iconic mascots and the exclusive platform action games that Nintendo would have, they're usually catered towards everybody. They're very family friendly. You think of games like the Legend of Zelda series, for example. You know, A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, and all these Legend of Zelda games. Of course, the Mario games. You know, the Mario platformers from Super Mario World and Super Mario Brothers, and you know, Galaxy, and all these other Mario titles. They're basically again kid-friendly, family-friendly games that anybody can play. It doesn't have violence. It doesn't have gore. It doesn't have really any kind of like sexuality to it, or any kind of sexual innuendo or sexual themes to it, where the women are so sexualized and so for adults and presented in a way that is catered towards adults. You know, we're not talking about you know, Princess Peach, or you know, even some of the other female characters they have, like I want to say Samus Aran. You know, Princess Peach, Samus Aran, Princess Zelda, you know, these female Nintendo characters, they're not presented in the same way that, let's say, for example, the Dead or Alive characters are. You know, the women of DOA. DOA is a great fighting series, and I really enjoy it. And it is very sexualized. They really have a lot of fan service and titillation, and, you know, they're fighting in bikinis, and they have breast physics, but, you know, their boobs are jiggling and bouncing up and down when they fight. And even the spin-off games like DOA Extreme are very sexualized, obviously. That's not the case with Nintendo. You know, maybe Nintendo will have, like, Samus in a sexy outfit, or in a bikini, but it's like, that's the ending, you know, at the end, that's the reward you get for beating the game really quickly. That goes all the way back to the 80s with the original Metroid. But that's about as risque as you got. It wasn't over the top. You know, it's not like Duke Nukem, or Dead or Alive, or any of these other you know, more mature-oriented video games. Nintendo always had female characters, and some of them might be like these slim, beautiful-looking characters, but they're not overtly sexualized. And as far as the violence, it's not over the top. You're not looking at a game like God of War, or Devil May Cry, or the Resident Evil series, or, you know, any of those violent video games, Dead Space. Nintendo doesn't have titles like that for the most part. They might get a Resident Evil game, like on the GameCube. The GameCube got a couple of Resident Evil titles. Great. Awesome. I believe also the N64 got Resident Evil games. But it's like, these are exceptions to the rule. These are video games that are outside of Nintendo's control. I mean, these are video games that don't represent Nintendo as a company. These are third-party games. You know, like the Resident Evil games are from Capcom. You know, the Dead Space is from EA. God of War is, of course, from Sony. And Nintendo, for the most part, doesn't have titles like that. You know, Nintendo is mostly catered towards family-friendly type of presentation. Whether it's Pokemon, you know, they have exclusive, like the Pokemon games, RPG series, very successful, very popular. It sold a lot of units. It still sells a lot of units. But it's for everybody. I mean, it's catered for young kids. It's usually younger children and younger gamers that play the Pokemon titles. And people like me that grew up on them, that is kind of nostalgic for Pokemon every now and then, that want to play Pokemon every now and then, every few years or so. You know, it's not violent. You know, Pokemon isn't really, it doesn't have blood or gore, and it doesn't have any mature themes to it. So Pokemon is really a very kiddie or kid-friendly franchise. Mario, Kirby, you know, Kirby's another one. The you know, Donkey Kong, the Donkey Kong platforming games like Donkey Kong Country. Let's see, Zelda, of course, the Legend of Zelda series. I already mentioned that, and all you know, Pikmin. I think maybe one of their more kind of mature titles would maybe be the Metroid games. Yeah, as far as exclusives go anyway, like Metroid is a shooter, you know, it's a little bit more, I guess, similar to other shooters, like sci-fi shooters, where it has to have a bit more violence, but even that, again, I don't think is anywhere near the more violent, the real violent first-person shooters out there, like Suffering, you know, Ties That Bind, or any of these, even something like a Call of Duty or Battlefield or anything like that. You know, Samus is I keep saying Samus, but the Metroid series is more, kind of a sci-fi shooter where, you get rid of the enemies and all that. You gotta shoot at the enemies and, basically defeat them. But it's not crazy over the top. But they do have some gritty games every now and then, some really great titles that really try to push the boundaries, that kind of come out of nowhere. They go, wow, that was pretty risque. That was a fun game. Something like Conker's Bad Fur Day on the N64. That's probably one of my favorite games of all time, is Conker's Bad Fur Day. Definitely on the N64. One of my favorite titles on the Nintendo 64 back in the day was Conker's Bad Fur Day. Awesome game, because it was different from the other platformers. It was mature. It had funny sexual innuendo. It had really violent imagery where it's like you're shooting at, the enemy's heads. You're fighting against the teddy bears, in the multiplayer, and you can blow their heads off with the sniper rifle and all that. Just amazing stuff, and a lot of funny jokes, a lot of adult humor, and so Conker's Bad Fur Day to me was a great achievement. It was one of those Nintendo exclusives, at least at the beginning. At the beginning it was an N64 exclusive. I believe it also got ported to other the Microsoft systems like Xbox 360, I think, later on. But originally it was this awesome, little quirky, fun platform action game on the N64, and it was on a system that was mostly geared towards a more family-friendly demographic, Nintendo, you know what I mean? And the N64 did have a few great titles that were catered towards a mature audience, like the Resident Evil titles, like maybe even something like Perfect Dark, or even GoldenEye 007 to a certain degree, because it is using, the first-person shooter, guns and all that, shooting at people. So it had a certain amount of violence, but certainly Conker's Bad Fur Day would be up there. That's the one that is definitely the one I could remember as being super fun and very memorable, and also very mature-oriented. But for the most part, I think Nintendo overall just has a kiddie reputation. Their reputation is that their games are marketed towards children and for kids of all ages, for everybody, whether it's kids and adults. But it's like, because they market it towards everybody, they want to get the kid audience too, so they can't have crazy over-the-top violence, and they can't have crazy sexual themes to it, and sexual overtones and sexual innuendo. They want to be kind of like the Disney in many ways, like the Disney-fied Disney company of video games. They're very family-friendly. So that's what Nintendo is. That's their role. And I believe there should be a role for that. That is a niche, not even a niche, but a market that should be, Nintendo has a place for that market. Because there should be games for kids, and there should be games for adults, and games for teenagers, and so on and so forth. I think also in later years especially, and I would say this maybe started, you could say this started in the mid-90s with the N64, but certainly throughout the 2000s with the Wii, and maybe even the GameCube. The GameCube, the Wii of the 2000s, and certainly now carrying into the Wii U and Nintendo Switch, Nintendo's quality in games and their output of actual titles have been very predictable. It's pretty much the same franchises again and again and again. It's very repetitive. It's the same games over and over and over again. It's Zelda, Mario, the same titles, Metroid, Donkey Kong, maybe a Kirby game, Smash Brothers, Mario Kart, you know what I mean? So it's very predictable. They have to rely on the same mascots and the same franchises that they've had since the 80s and early 90s. And so it's like they don't really have any new IPs anymore, or they don't try anything new or different, at least not for long stretches, and throughout a console's lifespan they'll have no new IPs. They don't have any new mascots anymore. They'll maybe introduce a new character in a Zelda game, or a new character in a Mario game, or something like that. But it's like it's the same games over and over again. It's Star Fox, Donkey Kong, Mario, Smash Brothers, Legend of Zelda. It's the same titles again and again and again, and after a while that gets really repetitive. Pokemon. How many Pokemon games do we get every single generation, in the handheld especially? So we get the same titles constantly. It's very redundant and repetitive. It's oversaturated. It's the same games over and over again. Not the same games, but the same names over and over again. Just in every generation, the graphics get a little bit better, and they add a few new things here and there, but it's the same franchises. And usually, for the most part, the stories kind of blend together. Like the Legend of Zelda series, for example, doesn't fascinate me at all. I mean, I liked Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past when I was a kid, back in the Super Nintendo days of the 90s, and even Ocarina of Time I thought was kind of a fun game, but I never fell in love with those games. I never marked out to them. I never grew attached to them. Especially because I was getting older. Especially as I got older in the 2000s, as a teenager, going to high school, and then experiencing other games, other more gritty and darker stories, like StarCraft, like God of War, like Devil May Cry, and other titles that were geared towards a more mature audience. And so, in many ways, I outgrew Nintendo. I became older. I became more mature. I basically became an adult. I became an adult, and Nintendo was a thing of the past. Nintendo stayed as a kid-friendly, for children type of company, and their games stayed the same. It's like Pokemon, still for kids, still an RPG. And the formula was the same. Pokemon stayed exactly the same, and so even though I enjoyed Pokemon as a kid in the late 90s on the Game Boy, Pokemon Blue, Pokemon Red, and the second generation, and Gold and Silver and Crystal, and so on and so forth, Ruby and Sapphire and Black and Platinum, I enjoy those games at its core because the gameplay is good, but they didn't have the same maturity that I do. They never grew up with me. They kind of stayed in that bubble, in that Peter Pan-esque, staying for children only. It was only for kids, for kiddified audiences. There was no mature themes in Pokemon. Pokemon was for kids. There was no gritty violence or any kind of sexual thing that was like, wow, now we're becoming more mature. They didn't develop into for an adult type of experience. I would love to see a more mature Mario, or a more mature Nintendo exclusive Nintendo games, more mature Nintendo titles, a more mature Pokemon, a more mature Donkey Kong. Not even those mascots, but just something new from Nintendo that's mature. Like a Nintendo exclusive that is like The Last of Us, or God of War, or Resident Evil, or even something like Metal Gear Solid, or Dead or Alive. Something that dealt with a more mature audience. And even something like the writing of the early StarCraft games on, StarCraft and Brood War. That had some darker moments in there. It was this kind of complicated storyline that was this sci-fi epic feel to it. But Nintendo, aside from its third-party support, sometimes they'll have a third-party game that's very mature. Most of their exclusives they just kind of stay stuck in that limbo of for children, or for kids only, or rated E for everyone. And again, not every game has to be mature, but it's like it would be nice for Nintendo to have that balance. And I felt like for many, many years, for decades, since at least the 90s throughout the 2000s, they stayed mostly as a company that didn't mature with their audiences. They didn't grow up with their audiences, or with their former fans. Former Nintendo gamers like myself, I grew up as a Nintendo gamer. Initially, that's what got me into video games, was Nintendo titles. Super Nintendo, the SNES, The original Game Boy, the big, fat Game Boy. I had a black one back in the day, the Play It Loud version. I liked it. And I enjoy those titles, but it's like they're kiddified action platformers. The N64. Grew up on the N64, and I enjoyed some titles on there, especially the mature ones like Conker's Bad Fur Day, like A Perfect Dark. And then with the GameCube, and I still have a GameCube to this day, but I haven't played my GameCube in I can't even remember the last time I played a GameCube. It's been collecting dust, just sitting there, just chilling. It's been probably about 6 years, 5 or 6 years, something like that I haven't played the GameCube in that long. Because I have no reason to. Because the GameCube didn't really stand out. The GameCube has some good games, but it's like I got the PS3, I got the PS2, I got the Xbox, the 360, a PSP, you know what I mean? I have all these other consoles that I could be playing games on. And also Nintendo, it's just Nintendo is lacking. Nintendo is lacking features. There's a lot of different things that Nintendo doesn't have that other systems have. Nintendo doesn't have the MP3 capability, where it's like I could store MP3 on the PS3. I could store movies on the PS3. The multimedia. Nintendo doesn't have that. The DS Lite. I think I compared the DS Lite with the PSP, the Slim PSP a while ago. There's so many things you can do with a PSP. You can put MP3 music in it. You can put videos in it, images, JPEG files. It's a multimedia handheld. The DS doesn't have that. And so Nintendo has turned me off for years. Years and years and years ago. It's like, I'm done with Nintendo. I'm sick and tired of Nintendo. Why should I keep buying or playing Nintendo games and Nintendo consoles when other companies like Sony and even Xbox, Microsoft, they have more features in their systems. They have more available things that you can do. They have multimedia. You can play, for example, in the PS3, you can play DVDs and Blu-ray movies. So there's more reason to keep coming back to the PS3. It's not just a gaming platform. Can you do that with the GameCube? Can you do that with the Wii? The Wii U, the Switch? Can you do any of that? I mean, I don't know, because I just don't care anymore with Nintendo. Probably not, you know what I mean? And even if you could, I already have that on the PS3 and other consoles. Even the PS2 back in the day, in the early 2000s, could play music CDs and it could play DVDs. Back when DVDs were expensive in the early 2000s. The GameCube couldn't do that. The GameCube had small little GameCube discs. They weren't DVD discs. They had their own little thing. Their own exclusive discs. So it operated differently. So that's why, Nintendo is very Nintendo-based. In many ways, Nintendo reminds me of... They're almost like Macintosh. Like a Mac. It's like a Mac computer. It's got its own thing. It's not compatible with a lot of other things that the PC is compatible with. Most times and often, for the most part, Nintendo consoles are very reliable. They're very reliable systems. They're very well made compared to some of the other consoles, especially during that 2000s period. The GameCube is a solid system, the Wii is a solid system, even the N64. These are really well made systems. The original Game Boy. Although my Super Nintendo did break down when I was a kid in the late 90s, so that pissed me off. You know what I mean? Just out of nowhere, out of the blue, it just broke down. It stopped working completely. Yeah, I mean, my Super Nintendo, my SNES back in the day, in that late 90s period, it just stopped working one day. It just decided to finally give up and quit. I was like, oh my god. So, yeah, that really made me mad. I was sad and mad at the same time because I had some good Super Nintendo games, but, that was the last time I played Super Nintendo, was probably in the late 90s, I don't know, 1999 or something like that. And I was just like, screw this, you know what I mean? Nintendo just kept pissing me off. They just kept pissing me off over the years. And they just didn't have any great games that I was interested in. It didn't have any exclusives that I was like, oh my god, I gotta play that game. I gotta play that right now. Even something like Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 would come out, and on the GameCube it was like, oh, it's shining on the GameCube. The best game on the GameCube, but it's available on the PS2. So it's not even exclusive to the GameCube. You know, it was also available on the PlayStation 2. Now, mind you, the PS2 version was probably the less impressive version. It didn't run as well on the PS2. You know, it had more. The PS2 was a weaker system than the GameCube, and the GameCube probably ran it faster or ran it better, but still a great experience on the PS2. It's not like, you know, a complete mess on the PS2. It was still a pretty damn good port on the PS2. So, you know what I mean? So it's like Nintendo has nothing. They have no exclusives that I'm interested in, and the ones that I am interested in, like maybe a DOA game or a Tekken game on a Nintendo console, like a Wii U or a Switch or a 3DS or something, that's a third-party game. A third-party title that that's already available on other consoles, on a PlayStation or an Xbox console. So it's not exclusive to a Nintendo system. Like, I want to see Nintendo create a super awesome exclusive that is so groundbreaking and so different and so awesome and so fun, but it's also mature and is for more of an older demographic. And I just don't find that with Nintendo for the most part. They just don't have that. And just overall, they've just been disappointing as a company because they just kept messing up throughout the 2000s. It's like they bring out this Wii system back in like 2006, 2007 period, where it's like they were red hot with the Wii because it was like, now Nintendo's coming back. You know, like the GameCube was a good system, but it just wasn't. It didn't sell as much as the PS2 or the Xbox. It didn't stand out that much. They didn't have as much interest or buzz as the PS2 or the Xbox. And granted, the PS2 and the Xbox had awesome exclusives, and the GameCube, I think, just didn't have as many great exclusives. So the GameCube was kind of like, whatever, nobody cares. And then the Wii comes in, but by the mid-2000s, or mid-late 2000s, and the Wii was like this super casual system. It was like this motion controls, like gimmicky, completely different, but it was mostly just gimmick garbage. You know what I mean? It was just gimmicky crap after gimmicky crap. It was party games and mini games, and it was just like schlocky games of shovelware that was not impressive. They got a few interesting games here and there, like Mad World, you know, and a few titles that was like, oh, that's kind of interesting, that's kind of unique, you know, a few exclusives every now and then that was kind of interesting on the Wii. But for the most part, it was the same thing again and again. It was Mario, Zelda, Smash Bros, Mario Kart, the predictable exclusives, the predictable kiddie games that we've all experienced before, that we know what to expect from Nintendo. So the 2000s end, Nintendo is even more casual and even more casual-friendly, kiddified than ever. Than even the 90s. They were totally not for hardcore gamers anymore. They were mostly for casuals and like motion sensors and that kind of gimmicky crap. So by the 2010s, now it's the 2010s, 2011, 2012, 2013 to present day 2018. They fail with the Wii U. The Wii U dropped in I think it was 2012 when it came out. So it's been well over half a decade. It failed. And I backed the Wii U. I was like, support this. There's reasons to buy it. They have some exclusives and third-party games like Tekken Tag 2. They were getting a port of Tekken Tag 2, which was supposed to be even better. And they have other games. They got Sonic All-Stars Racing. So the Wii U was promising, and I did back the Wii U. I was like, all right, Nintendo might turn around because now they got an HD console now. And now they can catch up, and it's even a little bit stronger than the PS3 and the 360. So it's like, cool. Alright. But the Wii U fails. Because they don't sell as much. Because people were like, man, I'm done with Nintendo. Sick and tired of the Wii. Because I think the Wii's legacy, in the long run, ruined the Wii U's chances. The Wii's legacy was so casual bullcrap, casual, family-friendly, like completely crappy games, crappy party games and mini games and all that stuff, motion sensors, gimmick sensors. That horrible legacy of the Wii carried over to the Wii U, and people that played the Wii were like, forget that, I'm not touching the Wii U. Screw that. I don't care about the Wii U. What does the Wii U have? It's going to be like the Wii again. So I think people judged it like that, which I don't necessarily agree with, but the Wii U suffered. It suffered big time. Very similar, I think, in some ways to this is not a perfect comparison, but something like the Sega Genesis and its peripherals. Like, it was a great system, and then they kind of started to fall off a little bit by the mid-90s. The Saturn came in. The Saturn was not that successful. It was like nobody was interested in the Saturn, even though they had some great games. And then by the Dreamcast in the late 90s, people were like, okay, Dreamcast is cool, but it's like, I don't care. I'm waiting for the PS2. I want something different, And I think that's kind of a similar thing that happened to Nintendo. Not exactly the same, but similar. The main difference is that Dreamcast has some interesting exclusives that were really unique and groundbreaking for the time, for the late 90s. The Wii U, I don't think it had anything that was groundbreaking. It had some some good exclusives, not even good exclusives, but good games, good third-party support, some decent titles here and there, like, a Mario game. But it's like, the Wii U just wasn't that impressive. It wasn't groundbreaking. It wasn't like, you gotta have this. This is a must-have system. So, the Wii U's library was kind of lacking, and the Wii U's hype and interest was completely done. People just didn't care about the Wii U. And now, years later, it's 2018, we got the Nintendo Switch. The Switch doesn't interest me at all. Because my support was for the Wii U. And the Wii U failed. It flopped. It's done. Nintendo was like, forget it. It's okay. It's over. We're going to move on to a different system. The NX, the Switch. Let's go. Try something different. Have the little, handheld thing, gimmick thing. And now we're going to use cartridges again. It's going to be a cartridge-based system, and it's going to have different things in it. We're going to have Zelda right off the bat. We're going to have Mario off the bat. We're going to have different titles off the bat that will capture people's interest again in Nintendo. So the Switch is initially relatively successful. They sell some units. They sell, they're selling. People are interested again because they're like, oh, what's the Switch about? The Switch is a little bit different? Alright, then we go check it out. I just don't care anymore about Nintendo. That's the bottom line. Because it's like, they just keep failing. It's either that they create too many gimmicky crap, or if they want to create like a hardcore type of, like hardcore focused system like a Wii U, then it just kind of flops. It just flops. So I don't know how to even look at Nintendo anymore. Like, Nintendo seems like a long-lost old friend from the 90s that used to be so awesome and so cool, but as you got older, they just became a lot lamer, and they're not as cool anymore, and they kind of got stuck in the past. It's like an old friend that's so stuck in the past, but they failed to improve themselves. They failed to evolve. They failed to adapt to the current world. And then it's like, as over the years, as the years went by, you just kind of grew apart. You drifted apart so much because this friend that used to be such a close friend or a best friend that you love to hang out with, Nintendo just became a distant, almost like a distant person that you don't even care about anymore. Because their lifestyle is so lame and so crappy and so pathetic that you just go, I can't get into that. They're just not cool anymore. They're just not interesting anymore, and they just don't have anything to offer anymore, except the same tired crap again and again and again. So I think that's why a lot of people hate Nintendo. And I'm gonna go read a couple of the comments that people gave here in this Quora. This is from Sean Bowley from March 18, 2017. Sean Bowley says, I don't hate Nintendo, but I stopped being a fan supporter of theirs after the rise and fall of the Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo, and N64 consoles. With those systems, the graphics and gameplay were solid. I completely agree. And there were plenty of third-party support for games. That's right, a lot of third-party support. So totally, I completely agree with this guy. Along with Nintendo's own games. Simply put, there was always something for every kind of gamer. However, starting from the GameCube and moving forward, the third-party support were on a steady decline, and Nintendo seemed to stick more and more of their family and kids-only image with squeaky clean games, thus outweighing the stellar Mario and Zelda titles. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is what I mean. Family-friendly, too focused on kid-friendly titles. People are hating on Nintendo because most folks are seeing the new Switch system as yet another console that will fall just as quickly as it arrived. And quite honestly, I'm hoping it will have quite a successful run and staying power like its forefather consoles once had back in the day. Yeah, that's the thing, dude. Like if the Switch is really successful, and I think it's relatively doing pretty good as far as sales. That's fine. That's fine that people are getting into it. You know, there is a market for a younger demographic, for younger kid-based games. That's fine. The Switch is, if it's successful, good. But that's the thing, is that it kind of puts Nintendo in this box where it's like, if they're not catering to kid-friendly or casual gimmick-type people, where they sell a lot, but it's like it takes away from their hardcore audience. But then if they focus on the hardcore audience, they kind of lose. I guess they kind of lose that casual audience a little bit, because they focus on the hardcore, and the hardcore is like, well, I'm hardcore, I'm going to be, I'm a Sony gamer, or an Xbox gamer, or a PC gamer, so the hardcore is not even going to think about Nintendo that much. So it kind of benefits Nintendo more to be more casual, kid-friendly than anything else. So unfortunately, that takes away from their hardcore image. Nintendo can be hardcore, I think. They can be a hardcore-based company where they have gritty, mature games and really difficult games like, Dark Souls or Demon Souls or something like that. But they tend to focus more on the casual stuff. Jansen Chon, this is Jansen Chon from BC, and yeah, so this is from Jansen Chon. Alright, the next post is from Jansen Chon. Jansen says, some arguments are very little for what you pay for, too focused on gameplay, no focus on outdated graphics, too childish, slow, obsolete before it's released, no real staying power, and no replay value. Well, I can agree with maybe a couple of those, but some of those I just don't agree with. Replay value, that depends on the game. It depends on whatever title you're playing. The Pokemon games have a lot of replay value, in my opinion. Smash Brothers can be pretty fun if you know what you're doing. So that's really not too much of a problem. Childish, I can agree with. Slow, I don't know about that. Very little for what you pay for. It depends on how much you pay for it. You can pay for games and consoles at used prices. You can go to Craigslist or even buy them used at a game store that's selling them at used prices. So you can get them for relatively decent prices for the most part. I guess some Nintendo cartridges, especially from the old school, the 80s and 90s, can be very expensive now, especially with that stupid retro collecting trend that's been going on for the past several years. I guess that can be pretty expensive, but at the same time, there's emulators. There's freaking emulators, man. So he talked about the Wii U. The Wii U failed, and now they have a new console. There were hardly any titles released for the Wii U. Nintendo does not want to make a Pokemon console game, nor do they want to look into development of an MMO type of game. They're missing out on some major markets by refusing to create for those segments. To a certain degree, I can agree, yeah. Because the Wii U did flop for various reasons, and that's because I already talked about the Wii U. Nintendo doesn't want to make a Pokemon. Yeah, they should have had a Pokemon console game years ago. They should have focused on that and have this epic, Pokemon system game, kind of like Monster Hunter. Like Monster Hunter is also available on the consoles, but it's also available on the handhelds. So there's multiple markets they can tap into, and I'm not really sure. I mean, maybe they are making that now. I have no idea. I haven't kept up with Nintendo news lately. Maybe they are perhaps going to make a Pokemon console title in the future. Maybe that is a thing. So, but for years and years and years, ever since even back in the day in the GameCube era and the Wii, they never had an actual dedicated Pokemon RPG that's like almost like a Final Fantasy, this complete, long, lengthy, epic game that is kind of like the handheld Pokemon titles. That would have been amazing. You know what I mean? That would have been fun. Especially if they had made it like mature rated. If that had been like an M-rated game, that would have been the best Pokemon game ever. Like, because that would have had gritty violence, sex appeal, and Pokemon gameplay. Like, that would have been so awesome. But of course, Nintendo's not going to do that. Eric Yan says, lately their performance has been lackluster. While the Switch has turned out to be successful, they're still recovering from the failures of the Wii U. The Nintendo copyright strikes on YouTube that prevent gamers from playing Nintendo games. Yeah, you know what, that second part, that Nintendo copyright thing, I don't even think that's a problem. Like, YouTube has had copyright strikes forever, ever since they began. Ever since like the 2006, 2007. That's been happening from movie companies and music companies and of course gaming companies and other media. They will take down stuff. So that is not really a big problem. Nintendo is just a part of that. So Nintendo's not preventing people from playing Nintendo games just because of copyright strikes. That's stupid. That's idiotic. And to blame Nintendo or to blame the copyright strikes, that exists because Nintendo wants to protect their IP. They want to protect their property. They don't want some idiot out there, these losers, that just re-upload stuff again and again and again. They just re-upload Nintendo's property, Nintendo's material. That's like me uploading, full movies and full like movie sequences and video game clips from just basically ripping it off and just claiming it as my own. And trying to basically get views off of that, or maybe even monetize money out of that. That's ridiculous. Those full motion cutscenes, or those FMV, or those video cutscenes, that belongs to the company. That belongs to whoever made them, the video game publisher, developer, whatever. Nintendo owns that stuff. They own that footage. They own video game cutscenes because they created that. They developed the game. Just because you re-upload it from your TV screen doesn't make it yours. I'm not going to be able to re-upload a full movie, or the entire, Alien movie, or the entire, Terminator movie, and claim that as my own, and this is mine now. No, it belongs to the movie company. So that's not a problem. But it is a problem that their system in the past, their systems in past decades have been relatively disappointing. Alright, let's see. This one is from Robert Wallstrom. Robert says, well, I sort of sit on the different forums to pick up on news from time to time, and yeah, there seems to be some people that sort of attack others just because they like something that they don't like. I think this is somewhat rooted in that some people think there is a console war going on, and you need to hold on to one team, sort of like you do in football. I also believe a certain part of these people are angry in general. This is probably related to family stuff or something, basically personal issues. I'm sure some people are just crazy. They got some personal, stuff to deal with on the internet. The internet is full of people like that, full of losers and just morons that have no lives. So he goes, I got a theory here. People in younger years are usually more receptive to absorb what they see or hear. And yeah, it's not really literally, but if they play a game with, for example, a negative atmosphere, they themselves will become more negative people. For example, Xbox. Basically, you have a game where you run around trying to shoot other players down. I can see this sort of messing the kids up. I don't know what Xbox game he's talking about. He's talking maybe Halo. Then we have PlayStation's biggest game, in my opinion. Here's just one scene. You need to like Then we have PlayStation's biggest game, in my opinion. Here is just one scene where you need to decide if you're going to cut off your finger or not. Well, I can see how this might affect people in the younger years. So, okay, so this is a really idiotic post right here. This is a dumb post. So this person is talking about how video games affect people, and that makes them messed up. Video games don't mess people up. People are messed up to begin with. This is a dumb post. I don't agree with this quote at all. And then they went on to basically kiss Nintendo's butt, saying that, well, then we have Nintendo's current biggest game, Zelda, the Breath of the Wild. Basically, it's filled with adventure and beauty. And it probably does. You know, the graphics are very luscious and very nice to look at. You know, the environment is very colorful and bright. So Nintendo games make people happy. And Nintendo games generally make people happier, which makes people that have a hard life or hard time act out less. Heck, they are probably happier even if their general circumstances are not great. But yeah, people that sort of act out probably have a depressing life in combination with playing depressing games. I see. So your point is that people play depressing titles because they're depressed. People, they like to kind of revel in their miserable environment, like miserable games. They kind of want to stay in that. And Nintendo is more of a happier thing, kind of like a Disney World thing. And so people don't like that. The people that are depressed don't like that. Okay, now I see what you're trying to get at. I don't know if that's actually true. I just think it's just people don't give a crap about Nintendo's kid-friendly, very basic presentation. It's too kiddified and it's too artificial. That's the best way I can describe it. It's got this artificiality to it, an artificiality of happiness. They try to make it look like Disney World or Disneyland, and it's too. It is too upbeat. It's too upbeat, and it's too. It's not even happy. It's like everything is like kid friendly. Like Zelda is kid friendly. Mario is kid friendly. You can have bright happiness. You know, you can have bright, colorful visuals and just kind of be a nice environment, but also have some danger here and there. Some blood, some really violent scenes in there every now and then. And Nintendo doesn't have that. They don't have no sex appeal. They don't have things that will appeal to an older demographic. That's my main problem with Nintendo. Alright, so one more comment. Chapley Watson. Chapley says, I believe that Nintendo's biggest power lies in nostalgia. Games like Zelda, Super Mario, and Metroid, Castlevania, Mega Man, Final Fantasy, Ultima, have a massive following because they were a big part of people's childhoods. Well, I mean, you know, games like Castlevania, Mega Man, and Final Fantasy, and Ultima, that's not Nintendo exclusives, but I understand your point. Some of those titles, they were ultimately on Nintendo systems as well, back in the past. If these weren't a part of your life, then you may see the Nintendo console as subpar and overhyped. I still play numerous Nintendo games on emulators, and it's really the only way to play some of the classics, because, you know, it'd take you 10 years to do anything without the fast-forward button. The nostalgia, yes. This is true, yes. Nintendo does rely on nostalgia a lot. I think nostalgia plays a big factor in their lasting popularity. The fact that people still love Nintendo, some people anyway, still love playing Nintendo stuff, is because they grew up on Nintendo. I grew up on Nintendo too, and every now and then I'll still play, you know, Pokemon on emulator. So I still have that nostalgic desire to want to play an older Nintendo game, but I just don't like to see what they've become in later years. Throughout the 2000s and the 2010s, they've become so disappointing and so kid-friendly that I'm just like, it turned me off as an adult. It turned me off. So yes, they do have nostalgic power or nostalgic draw, the ability to draw people because of the past experiences that you gave them in the older games. But that's the problem, is that when you rely on nostalgia, not so much that people are experiencing something new, but rather you're relying on the brand. That's the problem. You rely on the established brand name that people experienced back in the 80s and 90s, and then that's the only thing that you have. You're not creating new IPs. You're not creating new experiences. You're not creating something new. You don't have the Skyrim experience. You don't have Mortal Kombat experience. You don't have StarCraft experience. You don't even have like the MMO experience. You don't have like the multiplayer thing going on. You don't have gritty, violent games or sexy games like Dead or Alive, where you have beautiful, hot, sexy women in tight bikinis and they got the breast physics, and you don't have anything like you just don't have. You don't even have Call of Duty or like gritty shooters like COD or Battlefield or something like that. So what does Nintendo have? Nostalgia. They rely on their past names, and that's a problem because that limits your audience. That limits your ability to market yourselves. It just becomes Disney. It's just Disney now, and we all know what Disney became. Nintendo is basically the Disney of the gaming world, and that's really unfortunate. So I think that's it. I mean, that's I think why some people anyway, can't stand Nintendo, and why some people hate Nintendo. Personally, for me, it's not that I can't say that I hate Nintendo, because hate is a very strong word, but I can say that I'm just turned off by it, and I just don't care much about Nintendo anymore. And I don't even play that much Nintendo games anymore either. I just don't have any interest in it, because I'm an adult. I'm in my 30s. I want to play some games that's a little bit more gritty and more mature too, that I can take seriously and feel like I'm not being talked down to as a gamer. So that's it for this episode of the Review Space. Thank you guys for watching. Subscribe to the channel. Click on the bell button for notifications right away. And until next time, peace.